Om asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritam gamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Wonderful to see all of you. I had an amazing trip to India. I just got back on Sunday. It was a lot of fun. A whirlwind tour of many different cities, but my favorite was Uttarkashi. It's a place tucked away in the Himalayas. You can hear the murmur of the Ganga, Mother Ganga, the river, 24 hours a day, surrounded by beautiful mountains. It's really amazing. So, anyway, but it's also nice to be back. I start with the story of a pig. A female pig, a sow. It's a story that Sri Ramakrishna used to tell. He said, God, Vishnu, incarnated himself as a sow in order to kill the demon Hiranyaksha. After killing the demon, the sow remained quite happy with her young ones. Forgetting her real nature, she was suckling them very contentedly. The gods in heaven could not persuade Vishnu to relinquish his sow's body and return to the celestial regions. He was absorbed in the happiness of his beast form. After consulting among themselves, the gods sent Shiva to the sow. Shiva asked the sow, "Why have you forgotten yourself?" Vishnu replied through the sow's body, "Why, I am quite happy here." Then Shiva destroyed the sow body with his trident, and the Lord came out laughing aloud and went back to his divine abode. It's a beautiful story, but it should hit close to home. Because in a sense, we're all squealing pigs. And we're perfectly happy, most of us, wallowing in filth. To a greater or lesser extent. We forget our divine nature and we identify with these pigs' bodies in various forms. Different kinds of worldly identities, different kinds of ego, and ultimately body-mind complex. The physical body and the mind, or some combination of both. Spiritual life begins when we realize that we're in a pig's body and we're not satisfied with it. But then the challenge is, the struggle is, how do we get out of this pig's body? Right? And Vedanta tells us that there are 4 royal roads to realizing our true spiritual nature. The 4 main yogas. Many of you are Vedanta experts already, so I don't need to go in details here. But what are the 4 yogas very quickly? Bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion toward the personal God. Worship, prayer, japa, mental repetition of a mantra, and so on. Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, where we reflect on our true nature as pure consciousness. We're not the body-mind complex, we're pure spirit. Karma yoga, the path of selfless action. You engage in your daily duties, but you try to do them unselfishly, trying to take the ego out of that work, and then that becomes a potent spiritual practice. And then finally, the 4th yoga is Raja Yoga, the path of meditation and concentration. This is based on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So in any case, through any of these yogas, what happens? We gradually chip away at our identification with this pig's body, with these different kinds of worldly identities, and ultimately realize our true nature. And we break out of that pig's body. But then a question comes. If we're really, in our deepest essence, divine, if we're divine beings, if we're Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, how did we end up in this pig's body in the first place? Somebody asked Sri Ramakrishna this question, a guy named Vijay. This is back in 1882. He says, "Sir, why are we bound like this? Why don't we see God?" Sri Ramakrishna, "Maya is nothing but the egoism of the jiva, the individual soul. This egoism has covered everything like a veil. All troubles come to an end when the ego dies. The jiva, that individual soul in us, in its essence, is none other than Sat Chit Ananda. But since Maya or ego has created various upadis, upadi is a term from Sanskrit, and it's also used in Bengali. It's a term that Sri Ramakrishna uses a lot. It means basically a self-imposed limitation, thinking that we're something that we're not. But since Maya or ego has created various upadis, the jiva has forgotten its true spiritual nature as Sat Chit Ananda. And then he adds, Sri Ramakrishna was a very astute observer of human nature and a very astute psychologist. So notice what he says. He says, each upadi, meaning each self-imposed limitation, changes a person's nature. Upadi, U-P-A-D-H-I, okay, for any of you who are confused. He says, if a person wears a fine black bordered cloth, you will at once find him humming Nidhu Babu's love songs. This is back in the 19th century. Nidhu Babu was maybe the 19th century equivalent of Barry Manilow. So he's wearing some fancy clothes, he starts humming love songs. Then he says, Sri Ramakrishna says, then playing cards and a walking stick follow. If even a sickly man puts on high boots, he begins to whistle and climb the stairs like an Englishman. Remember, this is British colonial India, jumping from one step to another. If a person but holds a pen in his hand, he scribbles on any paper he can get hold of. Such is the power of the pen. Money is also a great upadi. This is Sri Ramakrishna continuing. The possession of money makes such a difference. That person is no longer the same person. And then he gives an example. He says, a Brahmin used to frequent the temple garden. Outwardly, he was very modest. One day, I went to Konnagar with Hriday, his attendant. No sooner did we get off the boat than we noticed the Brahmin seated on the bank of the Ganges. We thought he had been enjoying the fresh air. Looking at us, he said, hello there, priest. How do you do? I marked his tone and said to Hriday, that man must have got some money. That's why he talks that way. Hriday laughed. So he was such a sharp observer. All of you know this from your day-to-day life. You'll have known somebody for years, and then suddenly the tone in their voice changes, their behavior changes in subtle ways, the way they talk, the way they walk, and then you realize that they've gotten some new form of ego that's making them that way. So now, for the remainder of this talk, I want to talk about a new spiritual practice. Can't be completely new, of course. Nothing is really new in spiritual life, but relatively new. It's one that's recommended by Sri Ramakrishna, but it's not immediately obvious that it's a kind of distinct spiritual practice in its own right, because it combines multiple yogas together. Of those 4 yogas, I see it as a kind of combination of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, and Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action. And if you wanted to give it a name, we can call it the Who Do We Become practice. Who do we become practice? Okay, so what is this Who Do We Become practice? Here's the idea. In the course of the day, we identify with many different kinds of upadi. This is a term I'll be using throughout the talk. Self-imposed limitation. Mostly unconsciously. Most of the time, these upadis are unconscious. What are some examples? Husband, wife, parent, child, friend, lover, engineer, doctor, lawyer, janitor, boss, teacher, scholar, spiritual aspirant, realized soul, ignorant person, householder, monk, rich person, poor person, American, Indian, French, Democrat, Republican, and so on. The first step in spiritual life is to ask yourself, or not in spiritual life, but the first step in this spiritual practice, this Who Do We Become practices. Who do I become in association with these different upadis? Who do I become when I'm a father to my child? Who do I become when I'm a partner to my wife or my husband? Who do I become when I'm interacting with my coworkers? Who do I become when I'm listening to a certain kind of music, and so on? Who do I become when I'm stuck in rush hour traffic? That's appropriate to LA. Okay. What we'll find once we start asking ourselves this question is that we are different people throughout the day. We don't have a single fixed identity. Our identity keeps changing. In a certain sense, we all suffer from multiple personality disorder. It's a kind of spiritual neurosis that we all suffer from. we have many selves jostling inside of us. And each of these selves is associated with a different upadi, a different self-imposed limitation. And the ego thrives and feeds on these different upadis. It loves upadis because the ego itself is the ultimate upadi. It's the ultimate self-imposed limitation. The ego stays alive because of these upadis. So the more we're able to move beyond and transcend ego, the more we'll be able to eliminate these upadis one by one and then finally realize our true spiritual nature. So this new spiritual practice, which I'm calling the Who Do We Become practice, we can break it down into 3 steps, and I'll explain each of these steps in this talk. First, analyze. Who do we become in the course of the day when we identify with these different upadis? What are the different upadis that we identify with? What kind of person do we become in these different identities, in these different roles? That's the first step. Second step, of all of these different upadis, all of these different selves, all of these different identities that we adopt throughout the day, which is the best self? Which is our best self? And which is our worst self? And which are mediocre self in between? Okay, and then immediately the question will pop in your head, well, how do we determine what's best and what's worst? We'll talk about that in a second. But I'm just giving you the overview of the 3 steps first. Okay, so the second step is, which is, of all those selves, which is our best self, which is our worst self, and everything in between. And then third, here's the main spiritual practice. Let's strive to be our best self. Once we've identified that best self, let's try to be our best self in all circumstances, in all our roles throughout the day. That's it. That's the practice. Sounds simple, but hard in practice. All right. So as I said, one of the obvious questions that comes up, how exactly do we determine what's our best self, what's our worst self? It's actually pretty simple from a Vedantic standpoint. Our worst self is the most selfish self, the most egoistic. That self that is self-centered, that cares only about me, me, me. The best self, the least selfish, the least egoistic, the most humble, the one that cares about other people and puts others before themselves. Why is that the best self? Because that best self, whatever that is, that humblest, most unselfish self is the most perfect reflection of, manifestation of our true divine self, which we really are in our deepest essence. And of course, as I said, there's a wide range of selves between the best and the worst, at these 2 extremes. Most of the time, we're kind of somewhere in between, right? So to figure out, remember that first step in this Who Do We Become practice is, who do we become in the course of the day when we identify with different upadis, okay? To help us figure that out, to help us practice this first step, there's a particular doctrine in Vedanta that's extremely helpful. It's the doctrine of 3 gunas, Gunas. It's a doctrine that comes up again and again in the great Vedantic scriptures, especially the Bhagavad Gita. But you'll find that great saints, modern saints, ancient saints, they also talk about it constantly. And you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna, if you read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, he talks about it almost on every page. Gunas, the different gunas. What are these 3 gunas? First of all, what is a guna? Usually it's translated as qualities. I like the term or the translation energies better. Let's think of them as 3 energies. 3 fundamental energies that manifest in different ways in human behavior. These 3 fundamental energies are sattva, the best of the 3, rajas, and tamas. Okay. So the energy of tamas, if we have a lot of that, it manifests as laziness, kind of lethargy, dullness, a tendency to oversleep, procrastination, delusion, confusion, not very nice things. Rajas, the energy of rajas, that second energy, manifests as egoism, selfishness, boasting about yourself, arrogance sometimes, extreme ambition. I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to be better than this person, being very competitive in nature, for instance. Having a lot of emotional attachments and desires. So that's all. These are all manifestations of rajas. Thirdly, sattva. The energy of sattva manifests as humility, unselfishness, compassion, calmness, certain tendency to be kind of withdrawn into yourself. Not that you don't talk to people, but that you don't need much in the external world to make you happy. You know? You don't have that emotional neediness that many people have who are more rajasic. Having a meditative nature, being devotional by nature, being spiritual, having spiritual leanings by nature. So of course, okay, these are the 3 gunas, right? So how is this relevant at all? Well, the goal of life is liberation from rebirth and liberation from all forms of suffering and the attainment of endless fulfillment and bliss. We all know that. That's the goal of Vedanta. We can also call it God realization, self-realization. And Vedanta also says, for those of you who know something about Vedanta, you'll say, well, yes, but to get to that goal, we have to transcend all of these gunas, including sattva. And so why are you telling us about these 3 gunas? That's true, but we can't skip steps in spiritual life. Liberation is a very far-off ideal for most of us. And it's, of course, that's the goal that we always have to keep in mind, but it's not as practicable on a day-to-day basis. So there's a more proximate goal, we can call it. The proximate goal, the more immediate goal that's urgent for us as spiritual aspirants on a day-to-day basis is to become as sattvic as possible, to increase that energy of sattva in us. Okay. Sri Ramakrishna, when he was asked about the 3 gunas, he would tell this beautiful parable of 3 robbers. There are 3 robbers, and they see a wealthy person walking on the street. They pounce on him. They take his money. And then the first robber, who represents tamas, that lowest of the 3 energies, says, okay, we've taken his money, now let's kill him. We don't need him anymore, and he might run and rat on us to the police. Tamas tries to destroy you. And then Rajas, the second robber, says, whoa, let's not go that far. We've already taken his money. Let's just tie him to a tree so he can't escape. Rajas binds us to this world, this cycle of birth and death. So they tie this poor man to the tree, and they walk away. The third robber waits for them to leave, and then he comes back to this poor gentleman and says, I'm so sorry for what we've done to you. Let me untie you. And he gently unties him, being careful not to hurt him, gently picks him up, and then says, come, I'll show you where you need to go. And he holds him by the hand and says, you got to go that way. And this man is so touched. He says, you've done so much for me. Why don't you come with me? If it's such a wonderful place, come with me. And then this third robber, obviously representing sattva, he says, well, where you're going, I can't follow. So sattva points us the way to the highest goal. Once we become very sattvic, what happens is that the mind itself becomes our guru. And we won't need any further guidance in that way. Okay, Satchitananda itself becomes the guru. And sattva will point the way beyond itself. That's the beauty of it. So as I said, the first priority then in spiritual life for the vast majority of us is not to transcend the 3 gunas. We're so far from that because most of us are so full of tamas and rajas. The first priority is how do we bring sattva into every aspect of our life on a day-to-day basis? And that's what we'll be talking about. So put in terms of upadis, which is that term that I keep using in the course of this talk, we identify with many different upadis. How do we make each of these upadis, these limitations, these self-imposed limitations, these identities, as sattvic as possible? How do I become the most sattvic parent possible? How do I become the most sattvic boss possible? If you're a manager in a company or a boss or a CEO, how do I become the most sattvic student? Whatever it is your role is, how do you make that the most sattvic possible? Okay. The best way to do it is as follows. The most sattvic upadi of all is the eye of a devotee. The eye that says, I am a spark of the divine fire. I am a child of God. I am a servant of God. Sri Ramakrishna would call that bhaktir ami in Bengali, the eye of a devotee. Okay, the most sattvic upadi of all. So the trick is, this is the whole who do we become practice in a nutshell. how do we cultivate that child of God mentality, that identity of being a child of God, a spark of the divine fire, in all roles, in all circumstances, in the midst of all our various activities throughout the day? How do we stabilize that identity as a child of the divine? Okay. And you might wonder, well, even that I of a devotee is an upadi, right? And we have to get rid of all upadis. Isn't that the ultimate goal? Well, yes, but Sri Ramakrishna will say, when he's asked that question, he says, if the I must remain, let the rascal remain as the servant I. As long as you live, you should say, O God, thou art the master and I am thy servant. The I that feels I am the servant of God, I am her devotee, does not injure one. Sweet things cause acidity of the stomach, no doubt, but sugar candy is an exception. So this is a very Indian reference, but there's a certain kind of delicious drink made of sugar candy that's both tasty and it's actually good for digestion, even though most other sweet things are actually not good for you, right? Okay. Another objection is what I'm saying, that we should identify with this best possible upadi as a child of God and then only ultimately to transcend it. Doesn't that mean that when we transcend the three gunas that we're no longer a child of God? We're something else? No, it's not that. The idea is that when we become very sattvic, we identify with a very sattvic form of ego as the I of a devotee. And that when we finally attain liberation, we remain a child of God if we follow the path of bhakti, devotion. But we identify with our deeper spiritual nature because in our deepest essence, as souls, we're already children of God. This is the deepest lesson. That's why I gave the title of this talk, Becoming What We Already Are. Each of us is already a child of the divine. We're already that. We just don't know it. That's the point of the sow's body story, right? We don't realize that we're gods stuck in pigs' bodies, right? We're already children of God. So that's what we'll get to. Now, at the other extreme of the spectrum of good and bad, best and worst selves is the worst self of all. Sri Ramakrishna will call that the wicked I or the selfish I, the bodjat ami, or the kacha ami, using a metaphor of fruit, the unripe I, okay, as opposed to the ripe I. He says, so what is this unripe I? He says, the I that makes one selfish and attaches one to lust and greed is the wicked I, bodjatami. The intervention of this ego creates the difference between jiva and atman, between the soul and the supreme self or God. And then he asks, now what is this wicked I? It is the ego that says, what? Don't they know me? I have so much money. Who is wealthier than me? If a thief robs such a man of only 10 rupees, first of all, he wrings the money out of the thief. Then he gives him a good beating. But the matter doesn't end there. The thief is handed over to the police and is eventually sent to jail. The wicked I says, what? Doesn't the rogue know whom he has robbed? To steal my 10 rupees. How dare he? This is the wicked I. Extremely selfish I, almost vindictive, petty. Now, there's another objection. Many of you are familiar with non-dual Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, which teaches that from the highest standpoint, we are non-dual pure consciousness, right? So then, somebody who's following this path of knowledge, this path of Advaita Vedanta, may say, what you're saying, this who do we practice, it's all well and good, but it sounds kind of indirect. First you identify with the sattvic upadhi, then you have to go beyond all the upadhis. Why not directly transcend all these upadhis by identifying with pure consciousness? Simple. Right? And in fact, before I became a monk, after my PhD, I moved to India and I did a 6-month pilgrimage. And as part of that pilgrimage, I visited a place in the Himalayas. And I walked into a bakery and the woman working there looked at me. I was wearing white clothes, monastic clothes, but white clothes. And she said, what do you plan to do? And I said, well, I'm planning on joining the Ramakrishna order, becoming a monk. It's a 9-year process and blah, blah, blah. And she was happy to hear that, but then she said with a smile, she said, why go to all that trouble? I'm a follower of Ramana Maharshi. He was a great saint in Advaita Vedanta. And he used to say, just dive into the self. So why don't you just dive into the self? Why go to all that trouble? But it's not that easy. That's the point. And so Vijay once asked Sri Ramakrishna this question, kind of like the baker that I met long ago in 2010. Vijay asked Sri Ramakrishna, if without destroying the I, a person cannot get rid of attachment to the world and consequently cannot experience samadhi, which is his highest spiritual experience, then it would be wise for him to follow the path of Brahma Jnana, the path of knowledge, Advaita Vedanta, to attain samadhi. If the I persists in the path of devotion, right, the I of a devotee, then one should rather choose the path of knowledge. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, it is true that one or two can get rid of the I through samadhi, but these cases are very rare. You may indulge in thousands of reasonings, but still the I comes back. Therefore, if the I must remain, let the rascal remain as the servant I, as the child I. As long as you live, you should say, O God, thou art the master and I am thy servant. The I that feels I am the servant of God, a child of God, does not injure one. And then he says, the path of knowledge is very difficult. One cannot obtain knowledge unless one gets rid of the feeling that one is the body. Okay. Then he says, the path of devotion is the best path for this age. It's an easy path. You will attain God if you sing God's name and glories and pray to him with a longing heart. There is not the least doubt about it. And in other places, so, why is this relevant? Well, because these days, spirituality itself has become kind of commoditized, widespread, which is good in a way, but on the other hand, there's also a danger of dilution. It's becoming cheapened in many ways, and a lot of so-called gurus are making it seem as if spiritual life is very easy and you can have your cake and eat it too. And one of these quick fix kind of, or shortcuts to spiritual liberation is what's called Neo-Advaita. Neo-Advaita is basically the view that, oh yeah, all we have to do is tell ourselves that we're non-dual pure consciousness. I'm the Atman. I'm not the body-mind complex. And then lo and behold, we'll attain liberation. And we don't have to change anything in our lives. We don't need to become more ethical. We don't need to become less selfish. Because all that's Maya anyway. It's all unreal. It's all part of the dream. It's very dangerous. And Sri Ramakrishna was well aware of that. And he said, one may reach the ultimate by following the path of discrimination too. That's that path of knowledge. That is called Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. But it is an extremely difficult path. The feeling I am Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, is not good. A person who thinks this way while still having body consciousness does great harm to himself. He cannot make any progress in spiritual life. In fact, he is dragged down into worldliness and bondage. He deceives himself as well as others. He cannot even understand his own plight. So he ends up deceiving himself. He thinks he's realized that he's very spiritually evolved, but he's making no progress at all because it's just a kind of intellectual profession, just telling yourself and others that you're the Atman, but it doesn't actually, there's no trickle-down effect into your day-to-day life. So, for the vast majority of us, the far more practical and effective and honest practice is to cultivate the most sattvic of all upadis, of all identities, which is the I of a devotee, the child of the divine. So now, how do we maintain this I of a devotee throughout the day? How can we be our best self throughout the day? Well, spiritual practice is, of course, the first answer, and that's obvious, right? Whatever we like, and especially bhakti yoga, any kind of devotional practice. Many of us are initiated in some kind of spiritual tradition. We're given a mantra. We're told to repeat that mantra. That's called japa. So all these different kinds of spiritual practice. But it gets a little bit more complicated and nuanced, because our great scriptures like the Gita and many great saints say that even spiritual practices themselves can be practiced in different ways and more or less egoistically. It's a subtle point, but it's important. You'll find it in the Gita in the later chapters, chapter 17 and 18. Krishna gives an example. He says, giving in charity. It's a wonderful thing, right? Working in a soup kitchen. If you have money, you donate to a good cause. Wonderful. What's your inner attitude? What's your motivation behind that giving? You have to inspect that. Is it tamasic? Is it kind of careless, negligent? What does that mean? Well, it means I don't think deeply enough about whom I'm giving to or which organization I'm giving to. Is it a corrupt organization? Is a person going to use it wisely? What should I be giving to that person? You don't think about that. If a person's an alcoholic, let's say an alcoholic homeless person who is desperate for another drink, the worst thing to do is give him a bottle of whiskey, right? So that's all tamasic. So charity itself, I'm just giving one example of a kind of spiritual practice that can nonetheless it can actually harm you in spiritual life if you do it with the wrong attitude. So that's tamasic. Rajasic is what? I give in charity, but there's some ego behind it, which means what? Secretly or not so secretly, I want recognition for this great cause that I'm contributing to. And so I give, let's say, $1 billion to some kind of whatever, some organization, but I want my name to be emblazoned in bold letters on a plaque, donated by Swami Medhananda and whatever. And sattvic charity, sattvic giving, is there's no quid pro quo. You don't expect gratitude. You don't expect any kind of recognition. You can even donate anonymously. That's a good example of a more sattvic kind of giving. And you're very careful about what you're giving, to whom you're giving, so that you can make maximal benefit. Okay, that's just one example. But that applies across the board to all of our different kinds of spiritual practice. Anything we do can be done tamasically, rajasically, or sattvically. So we should try to be as sattvic as possible in our day-to-day spiritual practices. When we sit in the morning, when we sit in the evening, meditating. How do we meditate? Sri Ramakrishna used to say, "Dhyan korbe mone bone akone" in Bengali. It means one should meditate either in the privacy of your own mind, or in the corner of a room, or in a secluded forest. What's the common denominator there? Don't show off in your spiritual practices. Because the moment this idea of showing off creeps into your spiritual life, then the spiritual practice itself becomes self-defeating. It becomes another source of ego. The worst kind of ego is spiritual ego, in fact. This reminds me of a little bit from Family Guy about people who call themselves spiritual but not religious. I gave a talk here a while back on spiritual but not religious, that phenomenon. Peter is sitting in an elevator with God. And Peter asks God, "Do atheists go to hell?" God, "No." Peter, "How about people who say they're not religious but they're spiritual?" God, "Straight to hell." To the boiler room of hell, all the way down. Sometimes I pull them out just so they think everything is going to be okay. But then I put them right back in. Peter, good. That makes me happy. It's just a little bit. But spiritual ego. There's so many forms. There's the neo-Advaitic ego of... The neo-Advaitic ego is really awful because they look down on devotees. Oh, you have this quaint belief and blind faith in God? Oh, that's so quaint. That's nice. Maybe eventually it'll come up to my level. Spiritual ego. So what does it mean to be a very sattvic spiritual aspirant? Always try to cultivate the eye of a devotee, even in the midst of your spiritual practices. That means you should try to be as humble as possible. Don't be showy in your spiritual practice. Don't, keep it to yourself. This is between you and God. Don't throw pearls before swine. Be positive, be enthusiastic, and most fundamentally, that spiritual practice, often what happens is in the beginning everything's great, but then after some time the practice itself becomes mechanical. You have to force yourself to sit. You repeat the mantra, but you're thinking about 100 other things rather than what you're supposed to be thinking of. It becomes mechanical. That's more tamasic. So to make your spiritual practice sattvic, you need to bring in this inner aspiration for the divine, an inner aspiration to realize your true spiritual nature. That aspiration is really important. In Bengali, the term is bakulata. That's the term that Sri Ramakrishna would use. So always try to have that inner feeling, that inner aspiration. Keep that fire of aspiration alive in your hearts, in our hearts. That's why when Sri Ramakrishna would send out his young disciples to different places in the garden to meditate, often in the middle of the night, when they would come back, he would ask a question. He would ask, one of these main questions that he would ask is, did you have tears in your eyes when you were meditating? Why? Why would he ask that? It sounds like a funny question. Tears are a mark of sincerity and genuine feeling. He's making sure that their spiritual practices are not just mechanical, but that there's real feeling behind it. That's absolutely essential. It's the most important thing in spiritual life. But we're not out of the woods yet, because most of us, spiritual aspirants, even if we're given a mantra and a certain set of instructions for meditation and whatever by our gurus, that's not something we do all day, or most of us don't do it all day, right? We might do it in the morning, in the evening, when we sit in our meditation room, our shrine. Now the next question is, what do we do when we step out of our shrine? What do we do when we step out of our meditation room? What happens? If you're a householder, well, you got to make breakfast for your children, you got to go to work, you got to raise your kids, you got to interact with your spouse or your partner and interact with your coworkers at work. You got to be, as I said, stuck in rush hour traffic, all these things. How do you make each of those activities, each of those roles as sattvic as possible? Because Sri Aurobindo, one of my favorite statements of Sri Aurobindo is, all life is yoga. How do we make every moment of our life a yoga? How do we make it a stepping stone toward realizing the divine? Okay. So let's start with some examples. Our household duties. How do we do them? What's our attitude when we do them? If we're very tamasic, we're negligent, we're careless in our duties. We'll get to raising kids in a bit, but it would mean being kind of a negligent parent, for instance. If we're rajasic in our duties, we're very egoistic, boastful. We do something good and we brag about it to our friends and to other people. When we're sattvic in our household duties, in whatever duties are allotted to us in our day-to-day life, we do our duties to the best of our ability, but in a humble way, in an unselfish way. And the best way to do that is to do everything with this attitude of, I am a child of the divine. I am a devotee. I'm a child of God. And the real test here, the real test to see whether we're really doing things in this spiritual way as an eye of a devotee, rather than with the eye, the wicked eye, the selfish eye, is when we fail, when we don't actually get what we're looking for in our whatever our duty was. In the midst of failure, how do we react, if we react at all? Are we devastated? Are we really distraught? Does it take us days or weeks or months to get over? Do we never get over it? That means that we failed the test, right? And it's not all or nothing. It's not we're 100% egoistic or 0%, perfectly unselfish. That's not the way it works. But we should be honest with ourselves. And one mark of progress in spiritual life is that the highs aren't as high in that sense. Like we don't become ecstatic and elated. We remain even keel. And the lows aren't nearly as bad. It doesn't destroy us in the way that it used to before we took to spiritual practice. Okay. So now, relationships. This is a big part of most of our lives, many different kinds of relationships. Let's start with our relationships with our nuclear family. Our spouse, our partner, our children, other relatives. We all have to deal with them. Even if it's just visiting your parents for Thanksgiving or something like that. Ram Dass, many of you are familiar with Ram Dass, a well-known American spiritual teacher. He used to say, if you think you are enlightened, go spend a week with your family. If you think you are enlightened, go spend a week with your family. It's a good one. We're often at our worst when we're with our family. It's a fact. It's like, especially if once you're an adult and then you go back, it's like when you visit them just for a few days, you regress to some primitive form of yourself. That they put you in that same bedroom that you grew up in as a teenager. You got the same New Kids on the Block poster. That's a reference that most of you won't know. But anyway, I grew up in the 80s. And you're just not that, no matter how much you've developed and, all that, and you have a big position in a company, you come back to your parents and you're that little 5-year-old again. Eckhart Tolle, I gave a talk on Eckhart Tolle here a while ago. He has this great concept of the pain body. The pain body is an accumulation of old emotional pain, and a lot of that emotional pain stems from childhood trauma. And that's part of the reason why when we go visit our family, immediately that pain body is triggered. And it can bring out the worst qualities. And unresolved issues and traumas and emotional complexes and psychological complexes that we haven't dealt with explicitly, that we've kind of swept under the rug. And so Eckhart Tolle suggests, here's the best practice is, whenever that pain body is triggered, first of all, be aware of what triggers my pain body. And secondly, the moment you notice that your pain body is being triggered, take a step back.
That's it. Just be mindful of when and how that pain body is being triggered. And then what happens, the idea is that means you're no longer identified with that pain body. You've taken a step back from it, and it can no longer possess you. Okay? But Sri Ramakrishna, in the light of this who do we become spiritual practice, will add a kind of devotional element to this spiritual practice. And he would say something like, he didn't talk about the pain body, but I'm now kind of linking Sri Ramakrishna with Eckhart Tolle here. A great help in breaking our identification with the pain body is to identify with this most sattvic of all upadis. Try to maintain this identity as a child of the divine. Because the more you do that, the more you automatically take a step back from this pain body. That pain body is the selfish I, the rascal I. So the more you identify as a child of God, automatically you'll break your identification with that pain body. Speaking of the pain body, another frequent trigger of the pain body is our spouse or our partner, romantic partner. And you need to ask yourself, who do we become with our partner when we interact with our partner, whoever that is? And many people will find, this is true of all of us, right? Is that if you're a parent and you're married or you have a partner, you might be an amazing father, but you might be a terrible husband. These are facts, right? And why? Why is that? Because terrible father means there's going to be ego in there somewhere. And there's going to be pain and trauma and these kinds of things. And the best, when you're an amazing father, let's say, what is it? It's because you're the most sattvic. It's because you set your own ego aside and you put your child before you, right? That's always going to be the case. So, with respect to your partner, your romantic partner, let's use the 3 gunas framework again. If your relationship with your partner is tamasic, if it's dominated by tamas, it means that the relationship, there's a lot of negligence and carelessness in the relationship. You don't really care for each other at all, and you don't care about each other's feelings and needs. Often you're very selfish, it's all taking, no giving. If your relationship with your partner is rajasic, if it's dominated by that second energy of rajas, then both of you are, or at least you are, depending on what I could be asymmetrical too, you're emotionally needy. You're completely dependent on another person. It can become a kind of unhealthy codependence. There's a lot of drama in the relationship, lots of emotional highs and lows, very rajasic. I love you, I hate you, in the course of the day, in the course of one conversation. And if your relationship with your partner is sattvic, if it's dominated by sattva, you love each other. It's a deep love, but it's a love without clinging and without that neediness that you find in rajasic relationships. C.S. Lewis, many of you have probably heard of him. He's a great author and Christian thinker as well. He wrote a book called 4 Loves, and he distinguished the love of friendship with the love of eroticism, erotic love, romantic love. And he used, I think, a really apt metaphor. He said, the love of friendship is like walking side by side with someone. And erotic love is like being face to face. When you're face to face, you forget about the rest of the world. When you're side by side, you're helping each other along in your spiritual journey. You might even be holding hands, but without that attachment. And so even in a marriage, even in a romantic relationship, Sri Ramakrishna's advice was, using this metaphor, to gradually evolve your marriage away from this face-to-face kind of marriage to a more side-by-side marriage. Okay. Instead of this more pervasive Western mentality of, I'm 90 years old, but now I have to take Viagra to keep up my marital life. Better not. Let the marriage evolve and try to take the physicality out of the relationship eventually. Sri Ramakrishna would say to householders, he would say, after having 1 or 2 children, after some time, try to live with your spouse like brother and sister, side by side, right? Raising children. What does tamasic parenting look like? If you're a very tamasic parent, well, you'll be negligent, and this is fairly common. You neglect your kid. Oh, do whatever you want. The kid might be happy at the time. Yeah, I'm great. Now I can do whatever I want, play video games and this, that. But those kids don't turn out very well. So that's not good parenting. Rajasic parenting. It's called helicopter parenting. You hover over your child. You try to mold them in your own image. Indians in the audience might appreciate this. I'm ethnically Bengali, and Bengalis especially, they are often guilty of helicopter parenting because they have certain fixed ideas about what a respectable career would be. And it's usually like in a science subject, like you're either a doctor, an engineer, a computer scientist now these days. And so my dad, when I was growing up, he basically forced me to be a computer science major when I enrolled at Berkeley, even though I didn't want to be. So I studied computer science. I was pretty good at it, but it wasn't fulfilling to me. That just wasn't my calling. And so after a year, I was telling my friend this, one of my best friends there. And I was kind of feeling helpless. And he looked at me, and he just looked at me like I was crazy. And he goes, well, then why don't you change your major? And it never occurred to me because of that brainwashing from my parents. Anyway, so I changed my major, and I became a lit major, English literature and philosophy minor. And it changed the rest of my life. No looking back after that. My mom was fine with it. My dad was not happy in the beginning, but he eventually came around. And it's because of that, because I had that courage to really pursue my own calling, that I am where I am now. And so that's very important. Gita calls it swadharma. It means follow your own law of being. Don't follow another person's. What is another person? It means what your parents tell you, what society tells you. Figure out what's in your heart and follow that. So, all that said, now coming back to parenting, don't be a helicopter parent. Let your kid grow in his or her own way. That's being a sattvic parent. Sattvic parenting is we're caring, we love our children, but we're not emotionally needy. Our whole identity and self-worth isn't bound up with our children. Sometimes that's also, it can become very oppressive for the child if the parent's whole life is kind of bound up with that child. And we're neither negligent nor overbearing. So negligence is a sign of tamas, overbearing is a sign of rajas, but we're neither, right? I teach a class on Bhagavad Gita, and I have study questions. I give homework, and my students are so intense and sincere and hardcore that they actually, a lot of them do the homework. And I asked a question in the context of karma and rebirth in the Gita. I said, how does belief in these doctrines of karma and rebirth, how does that affect your day-to-day life? And there was one of my brilliant students who is a parent who said the following. He said, I think karma and rebirth have changed my views about raising children. The idea that I'm nurturing a soul that has been here many times and is on its own specific journey helps me to view parenting with more of a stewardship and guidance lens and not a possessive mentality. I see no need to create a carbon copy, shape a child completely to my own ideals. That would be Rajasic, right? Or save them from eternal damnation. I understand that a soul may have chosen me to help them along in this part of their journey. It's a subtle but powerful shift. That's a really good example of sattvic parenting, what he's describing really eloquently. It's a stewardship mentality. As a parent, I am nurturing a soul. I'm entrusted with the sacred responsibility of nurturing a soul and helping the soul of my child along on its own spiritual journey, which is different from mine. And so there's no question of dictating to the child how to be or who to be. So even our children don't belong to us. Our partners don't belong to us. We're all children of the divine. That's why this upadis, this I of a devotee, is so important. We start to lose this idea of me and mine in all contexts, in all circumstances. What about your relation with coworkers? If you're very Rajasic, you're egoistic, you're very competitive, you're very ambitious, you can be jealous if somebody's getting ahead of you. If you're sattvic, you're friendly, you're supportive. You want to help other people. You're unselfish in the workplace. And the best way to cultivate sattva is to do your work as karma yoga. You do it in a selfless spirit by cultivating that I of a devotee. And what if you're a manager in a company, if you have a leadership position? The most sattvic kind of leader is what's called in MBA speak, the servant leader, right? Servant leadership is a big concept. It's a very important concept. The best leader is the one who serves those who are under him, the ones he's guiding, the ones he's leading, or she. It's extremely important, and it's something that often takes time for leaders to realize. But when you come to that, you become the best leader possible. It might seem counterintuitive, but it's not. ultimately, at the end of the day. You'll be the most effective and successful leader, and the people working under you will be very effective and very happy with you as well. So that's sattvic leadership, actually. And then you have to ask yourself, well, apart from relationships, what about hobbies? What do I do what do I do for fun, for instance? What do I do when I get back from work, when I just want to relax for an hour or two? Do I watch TV? If you watch TV, what kind of shows do you watch? It's another question you have to ask as spiritual aspirants. There's a whole range of things you can watch. Very tamasic stuff, very rajasic stuff, very sattvic stuff, right? And it's true. What kind of music do you listen to? Most of us listen to music. When you're in the car, when you're at home, what kind of music do you listen to? Is it tamasic? Does it put you to sleep? Is it very repetitive? And is it rajasic? Is it the kind of music that's going to sort of make you more worldly in a certain way? And I'll get to it in a second. I'll give you an example. Or is it sattvic music, which is any kind of spiritual music, spiritually oriented music? It could be Western classical, sacred classical music. It could be in Indian music. It's called bhajans and spiritual classical music. But to give you an example, you can run an experiment on yourself. Who do I become when I listen to different kinds of music? Run it yourself. I think it's quite interesting and fun. I can't actually play the songs because of copyright issues. But here's the example I'd give. 2 songs of intense longing. But one song is intense romantic longing for an ex-boyfriend, and the other is intense longing for God. So the first song is Olivia Rodrigo's Driver's License from 2021. A lot of you heard the song. It's a catchy song. I'll just read a few lyrics from the song. I'm not going to sing them. I'll spare you that. And you're probably with that blonde girl who always made me doubt. She's so much older than me. She's everything I'm insecure about. Yeah, today I drove through the suburbs, because how could I ever love someone else? Ask yourself as you're listening to it. I'm not making fun of the song. I'm really asking you to run this experiment. How does this song make you feel? Who do you become when you listen to that song? Well, especially if you've just been broken up with, if somebody just broke up with you, this song could actually be very consoling, right? And it might help to vent certain emotions and feelings that you've been feeling. But at the end of the day, it's strengthening your identification with the little needy I. That I that misses that person who's left you. That I that needs that person in his or her life, right? Let's contrast that with another piece of music. This is much more obscure, at the other extreme. This classical composer from the West, his name is Dietrich Buxtehude. He was a Renaissance, a Baroque composer. He mentored Bach, actually, at one point in his life. And he composed these beautiful songs that put the biblical Psalms to music, from the Hebrew Bible, the Psalms. And my favorite one is entitled Herr, Wenn Dich, habe. It's in German. Lord, Lord, if I have you alone. So he puts to music Psalm 73, 25 to 26 from the Hebrew Bible. And the lyrics are as follows. Lord, Lord, if I have you alone, I do not care for heaven and earth here. If life and limb shall pass away, still you will always be, O Lord, comforting my heart. Still you will always be, O Lord, comforting my heart and my soul. Hallelujah. It's an amazing piece of music, and I'll try to include the link to a particular performance on YouTube that you can listen to. Who do we become when we listen to that piece of music? A different kind of longing. What happens is we identify with the longing, that divine longing, that spiritual longing, that aspiration of the singer. T.S. Eliot in 4 quartets, he's my favorite poet, at least favorite Western poet. He says, when he's talking about listening to music very deeply, he says, music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. You become one with that bhava, that spiritual attitude, and that can really help you to identify with this most sattvic of all identities, the eye of a devotee, this spark of the divine fire. And this goes all the way down to even the little things. Like, I'll give you one example. Well, what kind of clothes do we wear? That has an impact on how we see ourselves and how other people perceive us. And so be aware of everything you're doing. That that's true now, especially with social media and stuff. And there's a kind of arms race to kind of, especially in more visually oriented social media websites or apps like Instagram. There's an arms race to dress as scantily as possible to get the most likes and views and retweets and blah, blah, blah. So these are difficult times, especially for young people. Okay, so what are the takeaways from this talk? I think you can, if you read the gospel carefully, you find him recommending a new kind of spiritual practice at certain places, which I call the who do we become practice, which is a combination, as I said, of 3 different yogas: bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, and karma yoga. Okay. And there are 3 steps, and now you should all have memorized this, but I'll tell you one more time. First, analyze yourself in the course of the day and ask yourself, who do I become in my different roles in the course of the day, as parent, as child, as student, as worker, co-worker, boss, anything. Second step. Which of all those selves is my best self? Which of all those selves is my worst self? And which are the selves that fall in between on that spectrum? Best self, least selfish self. Worst self, most selfish self. Third step, let's try our best in every waking moment to be our best self in all circumstances. And the most concrete way to do that, the simplest way to do that, is to bring sattva, that energy of sattva, into all the different things that we're doing, into all of our relationships. And I've started to explain how we can do that. Swami Medhananda one day was asked by somebody, how can we have bhakti? How can we develop devotion, that aspiration for God that all these saints are talking about? And Vivekananda says, there is bhakti already within you. Only a veil of selfishness and egoism covers it, and as soon as that veil is removed, bhakti will manifest by itself. Each of us is already a child of the divine, a spark of the divine fire, and we don't know it yet. We think we're in a pig's body, but we're actually divine all along, playing that we're in a pig's body. We just don't know it. So how do we realize what we've been all along? Through this who do we become spiritual practice. Let's all try to see ourselves and look at other people not as these pigs' bodies, but as eternal divine souls, as sparks of the divine fire. Thank you.